Part 1. A turbulent childhood. The teenager destined to become Japan's greatest swordsman. One misty morning, at the end of the 16th century, in the remote mountains of Miyamoto Prefecture, Japan, the clanging of wooden swords echoes through the forest. While children his age are busy playing or helping their parents in the fields, a skinny boy spends hours wielding his sword tirelessly. No one could have imagined that the boy would later become a name that struck fear into the hearts of hundreds of swordsmen. He is Miyamoto Musashi. For over 400 years, Musashi has been remembered as the most undefeated swordsman in Japanese history. Traditionally, he is said to have participated in over 60 duels and never lost. However, many details about his life remain debated among historians, as documentation from that period is limited and not all accounts can be verified. But before becoming a legend, Musashi was just a boy growing up amidst the most turbulent era in Japanese history. According to records widely accepted by scholars, Musashi was born in 1584 in Miyamoto Village, Mimasaka Province. That was a time when Japan was not yet fully unified. Throughout the country, warlords constantly waged wars to seize power. These civil wars, lasting for decades, transformed many rural areas into battlefields. For the people, death was no longer an unfamiliar prospect. A boy born in that era had almost no chance of living a peaceful life. From a young age, Musashi witnessed a society where power dictated everything. Many sources suggest that his father was Shinmen Munisai, a renowned warrior skilled in swordsmanship and spearmanship. However, the relationship between father and son remains a subject of debate. Some sources claim Musashi was directly taught swordsmanship by his father, while others suggest he grew up primarily under the care of relatives after his parents separated or died when he was young. Whatever the truth may be, Musashi's childhood was certainly not peaceful. From a very young age, Musashi displayed an unusual personality. He doesn't like socializing. I don't like childish games. Instead, the boy spent most of his time observing nature, crafting wooden swords, and practicing alone. Locals say that Musashi had a rather rough appearance and paid little attention to his looks. He usually wore simple clothes, rarely groomed himself, and always carried a wooden sword with him. Although these descriptions may have been embellished over generations, they all contribute to shaping the image of a distinct individual from early childhood. At the age of 13, Musashi entered his first duel, an event that became a famous milestone in his life. The opponent mentioned in many records is Arima Kihei, a Shinto Ryu warrior. According to traditional stories, Musashi did not use a real sword. He only carried a wooden sword. When the match began, the teenager charged forward with such speed that his opponent had no time to react. A series of blows sent Arima Kihei crashing to the ground. If this story accurately reflects historical events, it would be an astonishing victory for a 13-year-old boy over a mature fighter. However, researchers also note that details of the match are largely based on records compiled many years after Musashi's death, so it is impossible to fully verify every detail. Nevertheless, the legend of that first victory quickly spread. A swordsmanship prodigy seems to have emerged. After that match, Musashi understood that his path would be unlike anyone else's. He did not want to become a samurai serving a lord for life. He wants to travel all over Japan, challenge the strongest swordsman, prove yourself through each decisive battle. In Japanese culture at the time, such wandering swordsmen were called musha shugyo, journeys undertaken to hone martial skills and perfect oneself. It's not just a journey of learning swordsmanship, it is also a journey of confronting death, and Musashi chose to embark on that path at a very young age. No one knew that ahead of that young man lay dozens of life or death duels, a historic confrontation with Sasaki Kojiro, and a journey to becoming one of the greatest icons of Japanese swordsmanship. If you enjoy unsolved mysteries, visit our channel for more fascinating videos. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Part 2. The Path to Becoming an Invincible Swordsman. After his first victory at the age of 13, Miyamoto Musashi's name began to be known by many people. But for him, that was not the ultimate goal. That's just the beginning. In late Warring States period Japan, a swordsman seeking fame could not rely solely on a single victory. Reputation was built only through deadly duels, where the loser could lose their life on the spot. And Musashi chose the most dangerous path. He left his homeland at a very young age, carrying a sword, meager belongings, and a single goal: to find the strongest opponents across the country. That was a period when Japan was gradually transforming. After decades of civil war, warlords still vied for power, but large-scale battles had begun to diminish. Instead, schools of swordsmanship sprang up everywhere. Each school of thought claims to be the strongest. Every martial arts school has masters ready to defend their honor with blood. If a stranger swordsman came to challenge them to a duel, they couldn't refuse. Victory will bring fame. Failure means the collapse of an entire martial arts school. That is the world Musashi entered. Unlike many other samurai, Musashi did not possess ornate armor or a retinue. He usually appears alone. Casual clothes. His hair wasn't very well groomed. His face was covered in road dust. Furthermore, many accounts describe him as being largely unconcerned with appearance, as long as he could fully concentrate on swordsmanship. This is precisely why many of his rivals underestimated him. They saw a man who looked more like a traveler than a swordsman. But just minutes after the match began, they realized they had made a fatal mistake. What sets Musashi apart is not his strength, it's about the way he thinks. While many swordsmen spend decades perfecting fixed forms, Musashi was constantly evolving. He observed his opponent, analyzed habits, anticipate their reaction. Then they struck. For him, swordsmanship was more than just a skill. That is the art of winning. He once wrote in the Book of Five Rings that the important thing is not to use flashy techniques, but to win. That philosophy sounds simple, but it completely changed the way Musashi fought. One of the most intriguing things about Musashi was his frequent use of wooden swords in duels. Typically, swordsmen use real steel swords. One small mistake can cost a life. However, Musashi often entered the match with a wooden sword that he had carved himself from a tree branch. Why? There are many theories. Some scholars suggest that the wooden sword helped him move faster and create surprise attacks. Others suggest that Musashi wanted to demonstrate his skill beyond the quality of his weapons. There is also an opinion that this only happened in some famous matches, not all duels as the legends often tell. Regardless, the image of Musashi defeating swordsmen, wielding steel swords with a wooden sword, has become an enduring symbol in Japanese culture. Not only was Musashi skilled in swordsmanship, but he also possessed a deep understanding of human psychology. He knew that many duels were decided before the two swords even touched. Therefore, he often uses tactics that make his opponents lose their composure. Sometimes he intentionally arrives late. Sometimes, complete silence is necessary. Sometimes, you might stare directly at the other person for minutes without saying a word. The opponents started to get angry. They lost patience. And the moment his morale wavered, Musashi struck. It wasn't just a victory by sword. Part 3. The Fateful Battle. The confrontation that changed the history of Japanese swordsmanship. By the early 17th century, the name Miyamoto Musashi had become famous throughout Japan. He repeatedly defeated renowned swordsmen, and even many major schools were wary upon hearing of Musashi's appearance. However, there was one name everyone wanted to know. If Musashi were to face the strongest swordsman of the time, who would emerge victorious? That person is Sasaki Kojiro. In many historical and traditional documents, Kojiro is described as one of the finest swordsmen in Japan at the time. He was famous for his extremely long sword, called Mona Hoshizawa, often translated as clothes drying pole, which was much longer than a typical katana. For many, Kojiro was almost the perfect rival to Musashi. If Musashi represents flexibility, unpredictability, and tactics, then Kojiro symbolizes precise technique, speed, and composure. Two geniuses, two schools of thought, two different paths, and Japan seems to be waiting for the day they clash. The duel was arranged to take place in 1612 on a small island off the coast of Busan province. Today, this place is known as Ganryu Island, named after the swordsmanship school of Sasaki Kojiro. According to many accounts, the match was held in the presence of officials and witnesses to ensure fairness. However, as with many other events in Musashi's life, some specific details still differ between historical sources. It is almost universally agreed that this is not just a one-on-one duel. It was a fight for honor. The winner will become a swordsman, admired throughout Japan. The loser may never leave the island. However, just before the match began, Musashi did something that surprised everyone. He didn't arrive on time. Traditionally, Musashi arrived later than scheduled. Some accounts say he was a few dozen minutes late, while other records suggest a much longer delay. While the exact number remains debated, his deliberate tardiness has become one of the most famous details of the story. Meanwhile, Sasaki Kojiro stood on the sand waiting. Every minute passed. The initial calm gradually turned into impatience. Then it turned into anger. According to many oral traditions, Kojiro believed that Musashi was frightened and fled. But the reality is quite the opposite. Musashi is preparing in his own way. While aboard the boat heading towards the island, Musashi is said to have used a wooden oar to carve a sword. If this story accurately reflects what happened, then it was one of the boldest decisions in the history of fencing. His opponent wielded a long steel sword famous throughout Japan. Musashi then stepped ashore with a wooden sword that had just been carved right there on the boat. To this day, many scholars still debate whether this detail is entirely accurate or has been embellished over time. However, That image has become an integral part of the legend of Musashi. The moment Musashi set foot on the sand, the atmosphere changed instantly. The sound of waves has stopped. The sound of the wind has stopped. All eyes were on the two swordsmen. According to many accounts, Kojiro was extremely angry. He drew his sword. The scabbard was thrown to the ground. Seeing this, Musashi is said to have said, "The person who throws away their sword sheath is the one who has decided they will no longer need it." No one knows for sure whether this saying was actually uttered as the legend says, but if it did happen, it would be a perfect psychological blow. It makes the opponent even more nervous. The distance between them gradually narrowed. A man wielding a steel sword, a man holding a wooden sword. Everyone thought that if Kojiro landed one precise slash, the fight would be over. Already. In just a split second, Kojiro struck first. The long sword lunged forward at incredible speed, but Musashi took a step back. At that very moment, his wooden sword swept down from above. One blow. According to many traditional accounts, the blow to Kojiro's head caused him to collapse and die shortly after, or not long after the match. The entire duel is said to have taken place in a very short period of time. If you enjoyed the story of Miyamoto Musashi, please visit our channel for more fascinating videos about other mysterious stories. Part 4. The Secrets of the Two Swords. The philosophy that made Miyamoto Musashi a legend. After his victory over Sasaki Kojiro, Miyamoto Musashi no longer needed to prove himself an exceptional swordsman. His name has spread throughout Japan. Many believe this was the perfect time for him to open a martial arts school, recruit hundreds of students, and enjoy the fame he had built. But Musashi chose a completely different path. He continued to wander, continue observing, keep learning. For Musashi, winning a duel did not mean reaching the pinnacle of swordsmanship. According to surviving records, he always believed that people only truly progress through continuous self-improvement and self-reflection. In the years that followed, Musashi began to develop what would become the greatest achievement of his career. It's a fighting style that uses two swords simultaneously. Today, this school is known as Niten Ichi-Ryu, often translated as Two Heavens One Style, or Two Heavens One Sword Style. At the time, this was an almost unprecedented idea. Japanese swordsmen typically use only one long sword when engaging in combat. Short swords were primarily carried as backup weapons, or for use in confined spaces. Few people think about using both at the same time, but Musashi was different. He saw an opportunity that others overlooked. According to Musashi, if a warrior carries two swords, why would he use only one? It's a seemingly simple question, but it goes against traditional swordsmanship thinking. He began practicing how to wield both the long katana and the short wakizashi sword simultaneously. Initially, many people thought this was impossible. It's very difficult to coordinate the two hands. The two swords have different weights. Attacking and defending simultaneously requires an extremely high level of body control. Just a moment's delay, and the swordsman will create an opening for his opponent. However, Musashi spent many years perfecting that method. What's special is that Musashi didn't build his swordsmanship on complex movements. He disliked flashy techniques. "I don't like tricks that only look good when performed." According to his philosophy, a technology is only valuable if it helps its user survive. Every strike must have a purpose. Every step should be taken in a way that conserves energy. Every move is geared towards victory. In the Book of Five Rings, he repeatedly emphasized that swordsmen should not rely too heavily on a single technique. If you only know one way to fight, you'll become predictable. But only by being able to adapt to every situation can you truly master the game. That's also why Musashi didn't just practice swordsmanship, he studied many other fields. He learned to observe nature, art studies, learn about architecture, practice calligraphy. They even painted pictures with ink. For Musashi, every skill can help people gain a deeper understanding of strategy and thinking. He believed that a swordsman who focused solely on practicing his sword swing would never reach the pinnacle. To win against others, you must first understand how you operate. One of the most distinctive aspects of Musashi's philosophy is that he did not view his opponents as enemies. He viewed them as people who helped him progress. Every match is a lesson. If you win, find out why you won. If you fail, find out why you lost. It was this way of thinking that allowed Musashi to continuously develop. He wasn't caught up in the glory of his previous victories. He was always looking for new limits. Over time, the reputation of the Nitenichi-Ryu school has spread far and wide. Many swordsmen came seeking to learn from him. It's not because of any strange techniques, because they realized that what Musashi taught them was not just how to use a sword. He taught us how to observe, how to make decisions in a life or death situation, how to stay calm under pressure, and most importantly, the way to win is through intelligence, not just brute force. Part 5. From swordsman to philosopher, the book that changed the world. If one only looked at his victories in duels, many would remember Miyamoto Musashi as an undefeated swordsman. But what has made his name endure for over 4 centuries is not just his sword. Rather, it is the ideas he left behind that matter. As he entered his later years, Musashi gradually distanced himself from the spotlight of duels. He no longer roams across Japan, searching for rivals like he did in his youth. There are no more battles to the death. There are no more challenges. Instead, he spent most of his time in contemplation. He began to ask himself a question. What is the greatest victory of all? Does it mean defeating dozens of swordsmen? Or is it about overcoming one's own pride, fear, and ambition? That was the biggest turning point in Musashi's life. Around 1643, when he was nearly 60 years old, Musashi decided to leave the hustle and bustle of life and retire to live in the Ragendo cave near Kumamoto. There are no luxurious dojos. There weren't hundreds of students. There are no hero parties. There was only a simple cave, a mat, an oil lamp, and one man spent almost his entire life confronting death. In that tranquil setting, Musashi began writing his most famous work, the Book of Five Rings, Go Rin no Sho. This is not simply a book on swordsmanship. It is a summary of the entire philosophy of life that he has accumulated after decades of experience. The name Five Rings book originates from five elements in Eastern philosophy: land, water, fire, wind, no void. Each section is not just about swordsmanship, it also reflects how people confront life. In the geography section, Musashi talks about the foundation. To build a tall building, the foundation must be strong. To become a skilled swordsman, one must first master the fundamentals. He argued that many people are too impatient, always searching for special tricks or techniques, forgetting that the foundation is what determines success. In the section on water, Musashi compares humans to water. Water can be soft, but it can also sweep away entire mountains of rock. A swordsman should not be rigid. He had to know how to adapt to each opponent, each terrain, and each circumstance. This philosophy also reflects Musashi's own life. He never fought according to a fixed pattern. Each match requires a different approach. It was this flexibility that helped him build his reputation. In the section on fire, Musashi talks about the battle. This is the most famous part of the book. He didn't just analyze how to use a sword, he also talked about psychology. According to Musashi, in any confrontation, the one who loses their composure first is more likely to lose. Therefore, a swordsman must learn to control his emotions. Don't let anger control you. Don't let fear paralyze you. Don't let confidence turn into arrogance. This is also why many researchers believe that Musashi was one of the first to view combat as a battle of wits, rather than just a battle of strength. Feng's section has a very special meaning. Instead of just talking about his own school, Musashi spent time analyzing other schools of swordsmanship. He observed, compare, identify the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. This shows that Musashi was not someone who only thought highly of himself. He understood that to make progress, one must first understand others. Only by knowing what your opponent thinks, does, and believes can you find a way to win. But the part that confused many readers the most was the final chapter, No Void. Musashi did not explain that void is empty space. He argued that it was a state where humanity transcended all technological limitations. At that time, all movements occurred naturally. No more forcing it, no more overthinking. The sword and the body became one. That was the ultimate goal that Musashi pursued throughout his life. Remarkably, more than 400 years later, the Pentateuch is still read all over the world, not just fighters. Many business people, managers, military personnel, and athletes have also studied this book. They didn't learn how to use a sword. They learned how to make decisions, learn to control yourself, learn to adapt to pressure. Many of Musashi's principles, written in the 17th century, are still considered relevant in the modern world. That is why this work is often ranked alongside classic books on Eastern strategy. Besides swordsmanship, Musashi also left his mark on the arts. He is famous for his ink paintings, calligraphy, and sculptures. Some of his works are still preserved in Japan today. Through these drawings, one sees a completely different Musashi. He is no longer the cold-blooded swordsman on the battlefield. Rather, he is an artist who loves nature, enjoys tranquility, and always seeks beauty in simple things. Perhaps it was this balance between martial arts and art that made him such a remarkable person. In 1645, as he felt his health declining, Musashi completed the final lines of the Pentateuch. Not long after that, he passed away at the age of approximately 61. There were no elaborate ceremonies. There was no army to see them off. Only one life can end in peace. But death is not the end. Conversely, it opened up a new chapter for Miyamoto Musashi's name. Because even after his death, stories about his life, his duels, and the mysteries surrounding him continue to be passed down from generation to generation. And to this day, one question remains unanswered definitively. How much of what we know about Musashi is true, and how much is just myth created by time? That is the mystery that will be revealed at the end of the story. Part 6. Unsolved Mysteries. Was Miyamoto Musashi a real person or a legend? Even after more than 400 years, the name Miyamoto Musashi is still mentioned as the greatest swordsman in Japanese history. However, the more historians studied his life, the more they discovered something strange. Many of the famous stories about Musashi cannot be fully verified. That doesn't mean they're wrong, but it's impossible to say for sure that all of it is true. Between history and legend, the line is sometimes so thin that it almost disappears. And that is what makes Musashi one of Japan's most mysterious figures. Mystery number 1. Is Musashi truly invincible? This is probably the most frequently asked question. Traditionally, Musashi is said to have participated in over 60 duels and never been defeated. This figure appears in numerous documents and biographies and has been repeated across generations. However, when comparing existing sources, researchers found that only a fraction of those matches had relatively clear records. Many of these duels are only mentioned in documents compiled years after Musashi's death. This makes verifying each match very difficult. Some scholars suggest that the figure of over 60 matches may reflect a long-standing tradition rather than an accurate statistic. However, there is almost no reliable evidence to suggest that Musashi ever lost a famous duel. Therefore, the image of the undefeated swordsman is still considered consistent with what history has recorded, even though the exact number may never be fully determined. Second mystery. How did the fight with Sasaki Kojiro actually unfold? If you ask a Japanese person about Musashi, most will immediately mention the duel on Ganryu Island. But the interesting thing is, no two accounts tell the story exactly alike. Some sources suggest that Musashi arrived about half an hour late. Other sources say he arrived much later. Some accounts state that he personally carved the wooden sword right on the boat. Some researchers suggest that this detail may have been added to highlight Musashi's image. Even the final details of the match can have subtle differences between sources. What most historians agree on is that Musashi was victorious. But exactly how he won, for how long, and with what specific tactics, will probably remain unknown forever. The third mystery, Musashi's true appearance. If you search for images of Musashi on the internet or in movies, you will find many different versions. There is a version that features a handsome samurai. There is a version with long hair and a cold, piercing gaze. Some accounts describe him as having a scruffy beard, worn-out clothes, and a complete lack of concern for his appearance. So, who is the real Musashi? The answer is, nobody knows for sure. The portraits attributed to Musashi mostly appeared when he was older or were taken after his time. None of the paintings can be definitively confirmed as accurately reflecting his appearance when he was young. This means that the image of Musashi in popular culture is largely a product of imagination and artistry. Fourth mystery, did he really use two swords in every fight? Today, when people mention Musashi, they immediately think of his style of wielding two swords. But many people often misunderstand it. The surviving documents do not indicate that he always fought with two swords. In fact, Musashi is very versatile. In some battles, he used a steel sword. There were battles fought with wooden swords. There was a battle fought with only one sword. There were battles that applied these principles, which were later systematized into the Nitin Ichiryu school of thought. What Musashi wanted to pass on was not a fixed formula. He wanted to teach how to adapt. If circumstances change, tactics must change too. That is the core of his philosophy. Fifth mystery. Did Musashi really write everything in the Pentateuch? The Book of Five Rings is considered Musashi's most famous work. Most researchers agree that this is his own work, completed towards the end of his life. However, like many ancient texts, the manuscripts were copied over many generations. Some wording may vary slightly between versions. This has led the academic community to continue researching the transmission process of the work. Nevertheless, the book's core message is still considered to reflect Musashi's philosophy and continues to have a profound influence to this day. Mystery number 6. What made Musashi a genius? Some people say it's speed, some say it's power. Some people believe he possessed extraordinary intuition. But when reading what Musashi left behind, one realizes something else. He almost never talked about having innate talent. Instead, he emphasized observation, perseverance, the ability to learn continuously, and above all, it's about understanding yourself. Perhaps what set Musashi apart wasn't that he was born a genius, because he dedicated his entire life to constantly improving himself. Timeless heritage. Today, more than 4 centuries after Musashi's death, his name remains present in many fields. schools of swordsmanship that embody his philosophy are still taught. Literary works, comics, films, and video games continue to draw inspiration from his life. To history enthusiasts, he was an exceptional swordsman. For martial arts practitioners, he was a master strategist. For many entrepreneurs and leaders, he is a symbol of disciplined thinking and adaptability. It is noteworthy that each generation views Musashi in a different way. Some people consider him a hero. Some people consider him a philosopher. Some people simply regard him as a historical figure who has been mythologized. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between those two extremes.